As the old saying goes, sometimes the person you take a bullet for is the one behind the trigger. Those words reign true in the rivalry between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa, a near 4-year saga that had humble beginnings and eventually blew up into one of the greatest stories that NXT has ever told. You could even argue that it's the greatest story that NXT's ever told. Two complex characters that interchanged roles and told the ultimate tale of friendship, betrayal, and manipulation. In the process, proving that the team of DIY was great working for a common cause, but they were even better as enemies. When you think about tag team breakups, there's always that thought that one person is gonna get Janetti'd, that one guy in the team will go on to great success and find a permanent home on the roster, while the other one eventually fades into obscurity. That didn't happen for these two. Both these guys became two of the poster boys for that brand, from walk-ins at the Dusty Classic, to sentimental crowd favorites, to tag team champions, inseparable best friends bonded by a common goal, then mortal enemies, and through it all told a story of hatred, jealousy, and proving just who the better man is. Always circling back to each other and remaining a constant for that brand. Undersized, undervalued, and underappreciated. Their story begins in 2015 in NXT. Two independent wrestlers and both of them walked into the Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic. Neither of them were under full-time contract, but as time progressed, they said goodbye to the indies and officially signed with WWE. The team was known as DIY, Do It Yourself. Two guys who were undersized and by any stretch of the imagination were not stereotypical top guys. Guys who had to push back against the machine and carve out their own legacy. When they first appeared in the Dusty Classic, they advanced to round 2, but that year's bid for the tournament ended right there. Over the coming year, Gargano and Ciampa continued to make regular appearances on NXT and build themselves up as one of the premier tag teams on that brand. By June of 2016, they were in the hunt for the NXT Tag Team Championships, and the story that was being told here was the classic tag team champions versus the underdog duo. Before that story is delved into, we gotta go back to the Cruiserweight Classic, a 32-man single elimination tournament to crown WWE's best wrestler under 205 pounds. In the final match of round 1 was the two brothers, Gargano and Ciampa. The match was filled with close falls, a ton of drama, and moments where both of them had the chance to put things away, but didn't because they were remorseful of ending the dream for their brother. Both had each other scouted and would reverse whatever was thrown at them with the greatest of ease. The crowd left oohing and awing at their chemistry. Ciampa had the chance to put Gargano away, but it was his hesitation to finish the job that led to Johnny Wrestling getting the win and having his hand raised in victory. The simple story told here was that Ciampa cared way too much about this man that he just didn't have the killer instinct inside of him to pull the trigger. At the end of it, both men sat in the ring paying respect to each other, but the earliest seeds of dissent were planted. See, every time DIY would go through a big loss, it was this image that you would see. Ciampa and Gargano hugging in the middle of the ring, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, but always, no matter the occasion, Ciampa always had his hand around Johnny's neck. Simple yet effective nuances in this story. For now, the story was between these two and two other men, Dash Wilder and Scott Dawson, a well-oiled, old-school, blue-collar team who were to each other what DIY were to one another. We made our way to TakeOver Brooklyn for the second of 4 consecutive summer showcases. TakeOver Brooklyn became the place where the saga of DIY was told. On this night, it was a loss for DIY, but it was one that easily could have gone the other way. Now where did they go? Back to square one, back to where it all started, the Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic. This time with a groundswell of support from the fans, the team advanced to the semifinals, but it was a revival who cost them a shot to win it all. Eventually, DIY was rewarded with a Tag Team Championship opportunity at TakeOver Toronto. This time, it had to be decisive and it had to be definitive. The fans knew that DIY could beat the revival, and fans also knew that the revival could beat DIY. But who could do it twice? We got the classic 2 out of 3 falls NXT Championship match. This was an absolute masterclass in tag team wrestling from both sides, and what made things better was a stellar TakeOver Toronto crowd. The first fall went to the revival after a shatter machine. A meeting in the middle gave DIY the second fall to tie it up, and now it was anyone's game. And that game was ended in a definitive way as both Ciampa and Gargano locked the revival into matching submissions and made them both tap at the same time, leaving no doubt a definitive crowning of new tag team champions. DIY had done it themselves, and now they were on top of the NXT Tag Team Mountain. A Match of the Year contender, an unforgettable night, and something so unlikely had happened. But as the saying goes, it's easy to get to the top, but it's hard to stay there. For DIY, now all eyes were on them. When it comes to organically being over with the audience, these two were. They just had this fun dynamic of two guys that really shouldn't be there, but were working every single day to keep their spot. What made it so much more fun was they just had this chemistry. They knew where each other were in the ring, everything mixed together to create something that the fans adored. Plus, you knew that they were really good friends, both strong in ring. But it was Gargano who was cheered just a little bit more by the fans. The chant of Johnny Wrestling ringing throughout arenas during DIY's performances. The crowd starting to see Gargano as the breakout, while Ciampa wasn't given that same level of appreciation. So you can imagine, in the grand scheme of things, everything started to fester. They defended the tag team titles against Tajiri and Tozawa, TM61 and the Revival, and everything was going fine. Then emerged a brand new tag team, the opposite of DIY. Big, strong, imposing powerhouses. The Authors of Pain, Akam and Razor. It was the Authors of Pain that would write the final chapter in these two's friendship. See, remember how earlier I said that DIY lost in the semis because of the Revival? Well, the team they helped win that match was the Authors of Pain. They won the Dusty Classic the same night DIY won the tag team titles, and AOP eventually beat DIY at TakeOver San Antonio. The two then began their chase all over again, but it was met by failure after failure after failure. At one point, we even got, and I do not kid when I say this, one of the most fun, underappreciated, and forgotten triple threat elimination tag matches ever. In this match, there were points where DIY and the Revival were working together to take down the threat that was the Authors of Pain. I recommend you seek this one out, I genuinely do, because for nearly 25 minutes, bell to bell, you'll be entertained like no one's business. DIY went out first in this match, and it looked like for Ciampa and Gargano that the magic was wearing off, that the fairy tale was all but over. Those tag team titles were the symbol of dominance, and they just kept fighting at every turn, but they would walk out as losers. Like I mentioned earlier, every single time they lost, it was arm in arm, and it looked like Ciampa was about to pull the trigger, but it just didn't happen. Eventually, we got to take over Chicago. These two had another chance to get the win. This time, they had to do it in a ladder match against AOP. At one point in this match, Gargano took the bullet for his partner when AOP had Ciampa lined up with a ladder ready to end him. When AOP was on the backswing, Gargano shoved Ciampa out of the way and took the ladder himself to save his partner. But the result, like always, was the same. And again, there they were, arm in arm, best friends. Guys who had been on this journey together the entire time. Guys who just shouldn't be there, soaking it in one more time at the top of the ramp. Only thing was, this was the last time. As the night came to an end, the bug in the corner appeared that the show was over, but the camera zoomed in for a close-up and Ciampa simply told Gargano that this was his moment. And that arm that had always been on Gargano took him by his neck and planted him right into the LED board. Unlike the Cruiserweight Classic when Ciampa didn't want to pull the trigger and had second thoughts, this time there were no second thoughts, no hesitation. He pulled down his knee pad and delivered a knee straight to Gargano's face. Even Gargano was on his knees simply asking why, in a last-ditch effort to remind his friend that this was not the way to go. The Psycho Killer was here and this was his moment. At that moment, NXT fans had one question. Why did Ciampa do it? Why did he break up one of the most exciting tag teams in the world? Eventually, we were told that Ciampa suffered a torn ACL, and Ciampa told the fans that it was because of his knee. He knew that he wasn't going to be here, so he couldn't let Johnny be here either. Flashes of his inner turmoil with himself. The psychology in this story was he couldn't let Johnny live to fight knowing that he would no longer be there. He couldn't let Johnny continue to gain popularity while he was on the shelf. He told everyone that because people started to replace him with dream partners, he in his head became an afterthought. He said that he knew that Gargano would replace him if he went away, and he couldn't let that happen. In his head, he was Johnny's only friend. There's a lot of different ways you can spin it. Either Ciampa didn't want anyone to replace him, or that he just used this as an opportunity to make his move, or maybe the Cruiserweight Classic was on replay in his mind, that he replayed the finish of that match on a never-ending loop, knowing that that was the night where he got left behind and Johnny Wrestling took off. Regardless of how you want to spin it, for Ciampa it was going to be a year away, so theoretically speaking, this could have put a huge wrench into their plans. But then the slow burn became even slower, and I'd say even more interesting. We branched off into a different path. A path of a guy who had been stabbed in the back by his best friend, now looking to find his own way. A few months after the turn, Gargano returned to NXT, the man who the fans adored, and his words were very simple: he had to be Johnny Wrestling again. So with his former partner on the shelf, Gargano went out and carved his own path, discovering who he was, finding an identity as a single star. Unfortunately, he found himself in a losing streak against Andrade Cien Almas. And again, we were at TakeOver Brooklyn. A year after he and Ciampa won the tag team titles, here we were all over again. Andrade and Gargano wrestled at that show, and in the closing stages, as Gargano was about to end the match, Zelina Vega threw in the famous blue DIY t-shirt. And though Ciampa wasn't there in reality, it was a ghost of Gargano's past. That simple throw of a shirt reminded Gargano that the evil of Tommaso Ciampa was still out there. That simple shirt cost him the entire match. The way NXT told this story was they had Johnny sit there like DIY always did after a loss. Ciampa wasn't there, and it was just the blue shirt taking his place. But the blue shirt, though inanimate, was a sign for him to remember. The losses mounted for Gargano, but he eventually pulled through and became the #1 contender to the NXT Championship held by Andrade. And at TakeOver Philadelphia, Johnny Wrestling was Johnny main event. Andrade and Gargano went out there and put on an absolute clinic in professional wrestling. They made fans believe that Gargano actually had a chance. For 45 minutes, these two delivered a smooth, well-constructed, and fast-paced match. Gargano fought his heart out, but again, he came up on the short side of things. He was soaking up the respect from the fans, everyone chanting "Thank you, Johnny," and as he stood there with his wife having his moment, it was a crutch that hit him from behind. You could say that it was the crutch that always carried him up the ramp after a loss. Tommaso Ciampa was back, leaner, meaner, more bitter than ever, with only one thing on his mind: make Gargano's life a living hell. The lasting image of TakeOver Philadelphia was Gargano on the ramp being tended to by his wife. On NXT TV, Andrade and Zelina wanted Johnny gone from NXT after Andrade had beaten him 3 times, and Johnny just wanted another shot at the NXT Championship. So the stipulation was, if Johnny couldn't win the NXT title, he'd have to leave NXT for good. When that match happened, again, Johnny tried, but this time it was Ciampa who cost him the championship and his NXT career. All that with the same crutch, maybe knowing that his friend's ultimate weakness was himself. The same night Gargano said farewell to NXT, again, the Dusty Classic started. Now what was born was not only an amazing rivalry, but the heel run of a lifetime from Tommaso Ciampa. He had gotten rid of the fan favorite. When he tried to explain his actions, all he had to do was hold the mic to his face, and the fans drowned him out with boos. All he ever did was remind the fans that Gargano was gone, and it was all at his hands. Johnny just kept showing up, trying to get the best of Ciampa, from knocking on his door, waiting for him in the parking lot, even showing up in the audience. Gargano just didn't say die. And the way this was told was Johnny Gargano was obsessed with getting even and making sure the psychopath doesn't dive further into madness. So we eventually had our match made. Ciampa, Gargano, TakeOver New Orleans, unsanctioned. If Gargano won, he was reinstated. If he lost, goodbye to NXT forever. This match headlined a landmark night for NXT, a night you could say was the pinnacle of the Black and Gold era, a night filled with great matches, big moments, and long payoffs. The 5th and final match was between these two. Ciampa walked into the Smoothie King Center as the most hated man on the face of the planet. No music, no lights, every person in the arena in unison showering him with hatred. All the animosity, all the pain that was inside Johnny Gargano came out from the fans in a sight you have to see to believe. Chants of "fuck you Ciampa" blasted the arena, and when Rebel Heart hit, it was a hero's welcome unlike any other. The bad guy versus good guy dynamic was figured out to a T, and it was on. Black Heart, Rebel Heart. Both men used anything to their advantage. They tore up ringside, they had callbacks to their previous match. As much as the two cared about each other, they did everything in their power to destroy one another. The final sequence was one that was particularly well scripted. Gargano had Ciampa down and ready for the finishing blow, and that same look that the fans saw, Gargano saw. A beaten man, all but out. But realization set in that this was his brother. At that moment, Gargano came to his senses and fell to the mat, showing that their friendship could be fixed. Gargano cared, but Ciampa didn't. Going for the cheap shot, Gargano escaped, locked in the Gargano escape, and made Ciampa suffer in pain before he eventually tapped him out. Gargano was back in NXT, and he slayed the dragon. But things were far from over. On this night, we also saw Aleister Black become the NXT champion, a championship that Gargano had been chasing, but he just couldn't get the job done. Eventually, he got himself another NXT title match, and while making his entrance, Ciampa attacked him wearing a Johnny Wrestling t-shirt. Knee into the LED board, driven off the stage into a table, and Gargano was now put out of action. Ciampa wanted it all to himself. The games didn't end. Ciampa would come out to Gargano's music to give fans false hope, and he was the man who just would not rest until Gargano was gone. Even on social media, this man was a menace to society, but he wouldn't dare do anything to Gargano's wife, right? Candice LeRae had been involved in this story, but she came in a little bit more here. She called Ciampa a broken man and said that she didn't know who he was anymore. She said that it was a simple fact that the fans picked Gargano, that the fans chanted Johnny Wrestling, and even Ciampa knew that Gargano was better than him. It had been played up that he was at Gargano's wedding. They always showed us shots of these three together, just hanging out as close as can be. Eventually, Gargano returned and teased a departure from NXT, but it was all a plan to get back on Ciampa. Gargano's wife tried to stop him, telling him that it'll do no good for him, slapping Ciampa, but she got caught in the crossfire. And when Candice got knocked off the apron, it was Ciampa, the ultimate puppet master, that pulled the strings just a little bit more. He told Gargano that he was the one who put his wife in harm's way, that he was obsessed with ruining his own relationship. So he took that as his shot to manipulate. Eventually, it was Candice who delivered Gargano that crutch before their Chicago street fight at TakeOver Chicago, the same place that the heel turn happened. It was Black and Gold NXT and a TakeOver main event. Of course, it was good. Ciampa at one point took Gargano's wedding ring off and spat on it, sending it into the crowd. A DDT onto the exposed ring mat ended the match, and for Ciampa, it was square. One win apiece in NXT. There he stood in handcuffs, having found a way, looking as devious as ever. The next order of business was a descent into darkness even further. Aleister Black and the NXT Championship. But it was a descent into darkness for both men that was coming up. Ciampa took on Black, and in that match, since Gargano was hell-bent on making sure Ciampa didn't win, he interfered and hit Black with the championship, causing the Demon to claim the crown and become the NXT champion. It had consumed him that much that Gargano had just done the unthinkable. It was all his fault. The nightmare had come true. Gargano over and over saying that the only reason he's NXT champion is because of me. It had consumed him that he let this happen. This led to an eventual black mass, and even the fans turned on Gargano because it was his fault. On that night, Black was found unconscious in the NXT parking lot. The question now was who attacked Aleister Black. At the following TakeOver, it was supposed to be a triple threat match for the championship between all three men, but it didn't happen. If you're following, you probably know where this TakeOver is. Of course, it had to be in Brooklyn. This time, it wouldn't be a 3 count that would do it. Ciampa and Gargano had to keep each other down for 10. A last man standing match, NXT Championship up for grabs. Another war between these two. You could say that the matches mirrored each other a lot because they were always good. Gargano's obsession eventually costing him as he went a little bit too hard in the finish, and Ciampa, by the skin of his teeth, retained the NXT Championship. The mystery continued on NXT of who attacked Black. Ciampa wiped his hands clean of the situation and was busy with Velveteen Dream. Eventually, it was Nikki Cross who emerged and told everyone she knew who it was, but she didn't need to tell people who it was. It was a simple super kick to Black's face that revealed it was Johnny Gargano the whole time. He needed a way to get Black out of the picture, and he did. He'd been so consumed by revenge that he started to turn to these tactics. Gargano revealed to us that he had to turn to the dark side. He had to corrupt his morals, beliefs, and ethics and end the monster that he created. That it couldn't be anyone other than him who beat Ciampa for the NXT Championship. And now he was the narcissist, saying that he was the good guy. He was the hero at the end of the story. He was embracing his dark side. Kind of fitting that his descent into darkness started with someone with the last name Black. This can be interpreted however you want. Maybe it was a brief lapse in judgment, maybe it was a plan to get back at Ciampa, or maybe it was Gargano truly finding himself. At War Games, it was another classic between Black and Gargano, the ending coming when Black hit two Black masses and told Gargano that he was absolved of his sins, the sins that the puppet master Tommaso Ciampa put onto Gargano, maybe knowing that this was the only way to keep him away. But Black also told Ciampa that he was the original sin. Black wanted a rematch, but before that, we had a steel cage match to end 2018 between Gargano and Black. A match that Ciampa gaslit Gargano into taking, and here's where things came together again for these two. Just when it looked like Black was about to escape the cage, Ciampa came to help, and for Gargano, maybe there was a moment of clarity. Both guys stared each other down from opposite sides of the ring, and just like they used to in DIY, they met in the middle, both of them taking out Black, Gargano getting the pin to take the win. So now the story went from these two hating each other, Gargano then slowly getting so obsessed he forgot who he was, to then going insane and corrupt, to now being on the most volatile and dark side he could be on the side of his mortal enemy. Now we're in 2019, and at TakeOver Phoenix, Black and Ciampa was the main event of the show. Before that came Ricochet and Gargano, where Gargano won the North American Championship. To end that night, Ciampa retained his championship, and we got a closing visual that a few months back didn't look like it would ever be. Ciampa and Gargano both standing side by side, holding their respective championships. DIY was now ruling the men's division on top of it all. Maybe it was Ciampa that helped Gargano find the best and most dark version of himself, and in turn, that was Ciampa's plan all along because he knew that he could enable him. Or it was a classic case of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. As the show faded to black, Gargano took his eyes off of his championship and put them solely onto Ciampa's NXT title. Coming back to what he said earlier, only he could beat him for the title. Ciampa was a man who never let anyone into his circle cause he manipulated through his actions and his words. As Gargano said, sometimes you have to give into the darkness in hopes of becoming something more. As champions, both of them went to SmackDown and Raw before Gargano lost his North American title. Ciampa showed some emotion here. He was upset because Gargano lost, someone he swore that he had no feeling for anymore. Mind you, this man spat on his wedding ring. Maybe it was because he knew that since the North American Championship wasn't there for him, it was back to him. We started in 2015 and here we are in 2019. One interconnected story that created new stars for the NXT brand, told layered stories and gave us great matches. But the constant remained the same, these two. And the event? Also the same. The Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic, back yet again and yet again used as a storytelling device in this saga. It was a 1 week stretch that made Ciampa realize that Gargano was at his best when he was with him. Ciampa was the one who made Gargano the deal that if they were together again, they'd finally do it. They'd finally win the Dusty Classic, the one thing that they just couldn't do. Him realizing that he had driven Gargano off the edge and finally converted him onto the dark side, and his puppeteering was working. Or maybe Gargano's puppeteering was working. DIY was back together and they ended up beating Undisputed Era in round 1. In round 2, it was DIY versus both their TakeOver Phoenix opponents, Black and Ricochet, but this time it was Gargano who seemed like the puppet master, faking a knee injury only for Ciampa to get pinned and the team be eliminated from the tournament. Candice and Ciampa helped a limping Gargano up the ramp, and it was just like old times, a repaired friendship that was back on track. Ciampa, showing his true colors and seeing that Gargano was again no use to him, went for it all over again. He called back to TakeOver Chicago, ready to plant Gargano's face into the LED board, only for Gargano to plant his foot, pump the brakes, and get even. This wasn't the real Johnny, it was a plan all along. For months, Johnny Gargano devised a plan to grow closer to Tommaso Ciampa, only to see the champion let his guard down and become more trusting. Now it was Gargano who got even and planted him into the LED board, and it was pretty obvious where this was headed. Round 4 between these two, this time with the NXT Championship up for grabs. WrestleMania 35 weekend, and it was on. But real life intervened and that match never happened. Ciampa had to have neck surgery and the big blow-off was gone. The NXT Championship was relinquished. Gargano would still fight for this title, however. His new opponent, Adam Cole. Maybe not in the way it was supposed to be written for Gargano, but when that night came to an end, he became the new NXT champion. There he stood at the top of the stage holding the NXT Championship with his wife. Similar to TakeOver Philadelphia, from behind came Tommaso Ciampa, and this time he just gave him a hug and raised his hand. Maybe the moment was supposed to come against him, but nonetheless, DIY had won it all and done it all. It had all come full circle. But this thing wasn't over just yet. Things went in a different direction. Ciampa was out with a neck injury, and be it how well it was documented, the fans kinda started to get behind him. The ultimate supervillain was now back and a fan favorite after he returned. He began the chase for the NXT title that he never lost, and between Gargano and Ciampa, all was good. In 2020, DIY reunited to take on Mustache Mountain at Worlds Collide. At TakeOver Portland, it was Ciampa versus Cole in the main event for the NXT Championship. Ciampa fought and fought and fought to get back his NXT title, but in the closing minutes, it was Gargano who looked down at the championship, then swung it at Ciampa to cost him the match. Maybe realizing that he just couldn't let Ciampa get one up on him. Couldn't let that championship he cared so much about drive Ciampa insane one more time. Couldn't let Ciampa fool the fans again before unleashing the monster one more time. Here we were 1 year later, and we were finally going to have the big blow off at TakeOver Tampa Bay, but again, it didn't happen. This time, it was a global pandemic that caused that. Though one way or another, we were going to get this match. It was labeled one final beat. Blackheart versus Rebel Heart. This time Gargano as the heel, and the premise was simple. Ciampa made his life hell for years, and then when he came back, everyone accepted him as the conquering hero, forgetting what was done to Gargano, and that bugged him. Ciampa hadn't actually changed in his mind, and that was all an act. Gargano had motivations that made sense. They went way further than the NXT Championship. It really felt like it'd be the last hurrah for these two in NXT. These two fought in an empty arena, and it was Gargano with the help of his wife who came out the winner. The two finally getting it done over the man that made their life a living hell. Maybe not the picture perfect ending it was supposed to be, but nonetheless, the end to these two's NXT story. A story that can be spun and depicted in so many different ways. All the way from the Dusty Classic to winning the tag team titles to the breakup and becoming single stars. When the days of NXT Black and Gold were over, they teamed up against Team 2.0, and it just made too much sense. Now they're on the main roster, and who knows where this story goes. If it gets revived, if DIY becomes as big as they once were. But this story literally had everything and slowly made two of the biggest stars that NXT has had as a standalone brand. And that's what's so special about this rivalry. It had so many layers, it had emotion, there was a consistent continuity and fluidity to the story that kept you guessing and rooting for and against certain characters. The ultimate underdog versus the menacing villain. Batman versus Joker. The quality of the matches were strong, and it just hit on all cylinders. A long-term rivalry that actually went long-term. There were points of the story that slowly burned into the next stage of development. This allowed for fans to critically think of the motives of the characters. Kept you guessing, kept you wondering what the next match would be, what twists and turns the story would take. When studying this rivalry, the character complexity is one of the biggest things that stands out. Inner conflict, jealousy, hatred, mental fatigue, telling this story through multiple different ways, using your mannerisms to help fans understand what may or may not be coming up. It really was something special. They had all the subtle nuances for the fans to focus on, for people to enjoy and come to their own conclusions of what was happening, what their motives were, and what this story was actually about. Depth, good writing, creating new stars, perfectly figuring out the babyface and heel dynamic. From the start till the end, the story of DIY and NXT was a pure hit.